I'm Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington Public Library, and welcome to Arlington Reads 2021. Thank you to the Friends of the Arlington Public Library for funding, and thank you to you, our library patrons. We've been humbled by your continued patience and goodwill as we navigate this bewildering time together. We have booked several exciting programs for you this year. Please check out our website for details and remember to RSVP for the full roster of our amazing Arlington Reads lineup, including Rebecca Traister, Layla Lalamy, and Valeria Luiselli. The theme for Arlington Reads 2021 is food for thought. Throughout the spring, we will be pairing our featured speakers with local restaurants, which have kept our community fed, energized, and connected, in spite of experiencing some of the worst economic fallout. Today's conversation with Jenny Offill is co-sponsored by the National Landing Bid. COVID-19 has ripped open the seams of Hannah Arendt's fabric of factuality. It has exposed long simmering isms, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and social and economic inequities. And while we have witnessed grace and compassion as our neighbors provided mutual aid, we have also witnessed a corrosive rise in dehumanizing otherness, a willful disregard for science, and an allegiance to lies. Like Lizzie, the librarian protagonist of Weather, we turn to stories and words with the power to place our experience in a broader context, the wider arc of history that compels us to acknowledge our shared purpose, even when forces are working at a feverish pitch to disavow our connectedness. Our nation is not yet broken. Perhaps it is only unfinished, as Amanda Gorman, the nation's first youth poet laureate, suggested in her inaugural poem. Perhaps we are merely paused at a way station on our path to becoming the nation we were always intended to be. And here to help us make sense of where we are is Jenny Offill. Jenny is the author of several books, among them Department of Speculation, which was shortlisted for the Folio Prize, the Penn Faulkner Award, and the International Dublin Literary Award, and Weather, a novel, which was published in 2020 and lauded by the Boston Globe as, quote, tiny in size, but immense in scope, radically disorienting, yet reassuringly humane, strikingly eccentric, and completely irresistible. Her critical work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review and Slate. She is co-editor with Elissa Chappell of the anthologies Money Changes Everything and The Friend Who Got Away, the author of several children's books, and writer in residence at Bard College. In an interview with Granta, Offill said, she looks, quote, utterly unthreatening, and that people pour their hearts out to her and try to recruit her for cults. With dry wit and piercing intelligence, her aphoristic fragments portend looming disaster that is only a gum wrapper lighter or tuna can lamp away. Although the tuna can lamp may burn out, while it is lit, it gives us hope. Please welcome Jenny Offill. Welcome, Jenny Offill, to Arlington Reads 2021.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we have the interview, I have millions of questions, and we're all really excited to talk to you about your latest book, Weather, but also your writing in general. Would you ground us a little bit by reading from Weather? I always enjoy listening to the author's voice, and that'll help us get started.
Sounds great. I'm going to read from the very beginning, and the narrator is a librarian in a university library. And this is just right at the start. In the morning, the one who is mostly enlightened comes in. There are stages, and she is in the second to last, she thinks. This stage can be described only by a Japanese word. Bucket of black paint, it means. I spend some time pulling books for the doomed adjunct. He has been working on his dissertation for 11 years. I give him reams of copy paper, binder clips, and pens. He is writing about a philosopher I've never heard of. He is minor, but instrumental, he told me. Minor, but instrumental. But last night, his wife put a piece of paper on the fridge. Is what you're doing right now making money? It said. The man in the shabby suit does not want his library fines lowered. He is pleased to contribute to our institution. The blonde girl whose nails are bitten to a quick stops by after lunch and leaves with a purse full of toilet paper. I brave a theory about vaccinations and another about late capitalism. Do you ever wish you were 30 again? Asked the Lonely Heart engineer. No, never, I say. I tell him that old joke about going backward. We don't serve time travelers here. A time traveler walks into the bar. On the way home, I pass the lady who sells whirling things. Sometimes when the students are really stoned, they'll buy them. No takers today. I pick out one for my son Eli. It's blue and white, but blurs to blue in the wind. Don't forget quarters, I remember. At the bodega, Mohan gives me a roll of them. I admire his new cat, but he tells me it just wandered in. He will keep it though, because his wife no longer loves him. I wish you were a real shrink, my husband says. Then we'd be rich. My brother's late, and this after I took car service, so I wouldn't be. When I finally spot Henry, he's drenched. No coat, no umbrella. He stops at the corner, gives change to the woman in the trash bag poncho. My brother told me once that he missed drugs because they made the world stop calling to him. Fair enough, I said. We were at the supermarket. All around us, things tried to announce their true nature, but their radiance was faint, and fainter still, beneath the terrible music. I try to get him warmed up quickly, soup, coffee. He looks good, I think, clear-eyed. The waitress makes a new pot, flirts with him. People used to stop my mother on the street. What a waste, they'd say. Eyelashes like that on a boy. So now we have extra bread. I eat 3 pieces while my brother tells me a story about his Narcotics Anonymous meeting. A woman stood up and started ranting about antidepressants. What upset her most was that people were not disposing of them properly. They tested worms in the city sewers and found them full of high concentrations of Paxil and Prozac. When birds ate these worms, they stayed closer to home, made more elaborate nests, but appeared unmotivated to mate. But were they happier? I ask him. Did they get more done in a given day? The window in our bedroom is open. You can see the moon if you lean out and crane your neck. The Greeks thought it was the only heavenly object similar to Earth. Plants and animals 15 times stronger than our own inhabited it. My son comes in to show me something. It looks like a pack of gum, but it's really a trick. When you try to take a piece, a metal spring snaps down on your finger. It hurts more than you think, he tells me. Ow. I tell him to look out the window. That's a waxing crescent, Eli says. He knows as much now about the moon as he ever will, I suspect. At his old school, they taught him a song to remember all its phases. Sometimes he'll sing it for us at dinner, but only if we do not request it. The moon will be fine, I think. No one's worrying about the moon.
Ah, that's terrific. I love those little jokes too. I've always been a fan of the blah, blah, blah walks into a bar and
yeah,
but it's terrific. So about a year ago to the day, you were here in the Washington area at Politics and Prose. and you and the interviewer were having a little bit of banter about the virus, as it was then known,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not masks were a thing. And it was a fairly substantially filled venue.
Mm-hmm.
And you all were sitting close together. And so that was a year ago. And then the world changed. So what were your thoughts, just you as an author, writer, or just a person living today? What were your thoughts? Like, when did you know this was kind of an uh-oh moment and much more serious than originally described or imagined? That's the first part. And then the second part, how did that affect your craft, or how you view the world going forward? Or could you say to yourself, see, I got some of that stuff right in weather. Look where we are.
Well, my book came out on February 11th of last year. And I did manage a sort of whirlwind couple of weeks of traveling. And it's interesting because I know I can look at my calendar and know when I became worried and not worried. Because, I mean, honestly, in the weeks of that, I was in dozens of cars and hotels and airports. But at the time, people really were worried about contamination, that you would touch things. So I remember that was, people would started to make that kind of awkward, like, oh, do we hug or not hug? I feel like it was right before the Politics and Prose event, but it still felt like it still had not occurred to me that it was worrisome to breathe the air the other people are breathing. Now, my husband, who's a very mathematical person, had been concerned for a while about it. I think he went ahead and stocked up a little bit for us, and I believe he bought some masks before you were told not to do that. But what happened was, in the middle of my tour, I was reading and researching, and I became quite afraid. Mm-hmm. It seemed to me that there was a lot. I have friends in Italy, and it felt very much like, talk about time travel. They would write and say, you guys are 2 weeks behind us, or and so I canceled a trip I had to England. And it was interesting because in that moment I felt quite alarmist. And 2 days later, everything shut down. So I would say that the way that it related a little bit to weather was, obviously, it's a very different kind of emergency I'm describing there, but the human tendency to not believe that disaster is happening, to deny it, was something I'd been reading about and interested in for years. And it was funny to see it not only in my own life, but then in all the lives of so many people around me, because there was quite a range of how long it took people to take it seriously.
All right, so Department of Speculation was your second book. Mm-hmm. And you began presumably working on weather, and weather took you roughly 7 years.
Yeah, I'd say about 6 or 7 years, which for me is just lickety split.
I think that. So what was going on with you at the time when you were turning your attention to climate change and destroying the planet? What were the influences? Were there writers you were particularly interested in? Was it looking at your own life? I mean, what was it that pushed you in the direction to write weather?
Well, I think it was a couple of things that converged. One of them was, honestly, a decade of conversations with my good friend Lydia Millett, who's a novelist and an environmentalist. And she had just been telling me things for years that it's not that I didn't believe them, but I just they all felt like pieces to a puzzle that I didn't know what the puzzle was going to be. But then one day I read this article that was in the New York Times Magazine, and it was about a very well-known environmentalist, Paul Kingsnorth, now also a novelist, walking away from the environmental movement and saying, we're offering this false hope that we can stop climate change, but it's too far gone. And I asked both Lydia and some other people in the organization she worked in about it. And I was sort of stunned when the head of the organization said, "Oh yeah, we've all known that, who really work in this field for a long time, but I don't think it means you should quit. You still have to keep working."
Mhm.
And I was so fascinated by that idea that there was this kind of one way that people were talking in public and another way privately that they felt that was much darker. And I began to read about it, and I kept going further and further into sort of research holes where it would become just scientists talking.
Mhm.
And I saw that the predictions were much more dire than since the last time I checked in. And then I think at a certain point, it flipped a switch.
Mhm.
And I myself began to think about what it meant, as most people do initially, just for myself and my family, but then the larger implications for the world. And that's when I started to think, is there any way to write about this and not use the post-apocalyptic frame that's very common in climate things, but that is more about what it feels like to be in this pre-apocalyptic moment where we see something coming, but we're not sure what form and how it's going to arrive. And that was sort of the very beginnings of creating this character and
Mhm.
thinking about it.
Okay, and you created this amazing character who is a librarian, and librarians are very excited about that. It's not often that we get to be the protagonist, and she's not like a stereotypical librarian. I mean, she's a smart and engaging person. And what was going on? Like, why a librarian, and why not, a scientist or a researcher?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we all have these imaginary other paths we might have taken, other jobs that we imagine we would have liked. And one of mine is a librarian. Almost all the librarians I've ever met are really interesting people with like very far-ranging interests, usually with a really good sense of humor, because they're dealing with pretty complicated cross-section of society every day. The ideas people have about librarians can be very outdated. Maybe it goes back to their school librarian, but the ones that I've met or encountered, they tend to be almost like holding down the fort of a part of their community as the social fabric's fraying. They may be the person someone comes to when they've lost a job. That may be where some of the homeless folks in the community feel welcomed to come in. Young kids, I know when I was a kid, we'd move somewhere new and I would be taken to the library, and that would be what would occupy me, to get those free books.
Mhm.
So I knew that I wanted this character to be someone who was in the community. In Department, it's a very interior book and it's mostly about her family,
Mhm.
but I knew that I wanted her to kind of be picking up almost the currents of the emotional weather around her, as well as the actual physical weather. And so a librarian just seemed like the best to me. And also I'm a very bookish person. So it felt like a good way to get to shoehorn bookish things in.
Well, the other part too is Lizzie is very compassionate. And you mentioned libraries and their role in the community. I think increasingly, I've been in this profession for 1,000 years now, but the role has really evolved. It's gone from being very passive to very center of the community, particularly in the public library. It's where people go to get basic information about how to fill out tax forms, or how to look for a job, or build a resume, or find childcare. And so the library school education that all of us went through was very different from the reality on the ground today. So you talk about weather in the book, but you also touch on a lot of other topics as well. I mean, there's addiction that Henry faces. There's new parenthood. There's hippy dippy ideas of what pregnancy and new parenthood is about. There's othering. Somebody lives in the Pakistani quote unquote neighborhood. There's the mania to place your child in the premier preschool because otherwise their life is ruined. So you touch on a lot of other social anxieties, if you will, some probably more pressing than others. Was that, how did that come about? That you included all of these other sort of social anxieties and impulses?
Well, I guess I was just trying to situate this character, Lizzie, like where she was. She lives in a very large and very diverse neighborhood, as many parts of Brooklyn are, where it had people from all over the world who'd settled there. And her child goes to a school that most of the kids are Bangladeshi or Pakistani. And I guess what I wanted was, I wanted it to be a city novel in the sense that I somehow wanted that feeling of excitement and serendipity that you have in a city, that you may just have an interesting conversation, even just when you go into the bodega or when you are just walking by on the street. But I also wanted to, because she is aware kind of these, I think, issues of societal fraying, these ties. She's very aware of things like the gentrification in her neighborhood. And she and her family are very much in this category, I think, like academics call it, the like precariat. It's like you're an adjunct, you're a freelance worker. In many ways, you have social advantages, and maybe if you're white, additional advantages from that kind of being propped up systemically. But in terms of the day-to-day life, you're quite, it's quite precarious financially. And so I felt like from that perch, she could both be listening to the woman who was obsessed with her kid going to college when the kid wasn't even, but also be realizing that some of the mothers that she talks to on the playground, that they have a completely world of concerns that she doesn't know about and can't enter into, that might come with multi-generational living or being an immigrant. So she's trying to kind of pick up both at the library and on the streets. It's funny, I was just teaching Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower today, and the main character in it has hyper empathy, which means you can feel the pain and I guess the joy of others too, but mostly in this situation, it's the pain. And I feel like Lizzie's kind of like that. She's very porous. And so everything around her kind of gets in, and it's a little bit of a disadvantage at times, but it also makes her, I think, a good friend and a good sister. I don't know about wife, but she's good at the other things.
Well, and she certainly conveys that sense of hope, that we're just a tuna fish can lamp away from doom and gloom, and yet it's funny, you talked about the empathetic character. There's a very old Star Trek first series episode about an empath.
Oh,
you ever want to go back?
I'd love to
the James Kirk, the original series. It's a really great episode. But I want to talk a little bit too about your writing style, which is I guess it's been called fragmented, or using fragments. And Parl Siegel wrote a very interesting and full portrait of you, I guess, a year ago in the New York Times Magazine, where she showed a picture actually of a poster board with all of these pieces of paper. So how did you happen to hit on that kind of style for both Department of Speculation, but also the current book, Weather? Like, what about that writing in fragments enables you to tell the story that you want to tell?
I had always liked, I think it's a little bit more of a tradition in European literature. I'd always liked novels that had a sense of these kind of small moments being juxtaposed together. Sometimes I call them walking around novels, where it seems like someone is just experiencing like little bits of the life in their city. And so I admired that. And I also admired it in kind of the tradition of essays and in more narrative poetry. But with my first novel, I still wrote in a more conventional style, and I just kind of nested the stories within each other. And then the writing of Department of Speculation, I mean, it was partly out of necessity because I had very little time. to write in what had been sort of these longer sections. And so because I'm very interested in like the actual sentence by sentence part of it, I found that the only way that I could do that was to write sort of at the paragraph level and then save it and then do the putting it together at a later step. So it was kind of a little bit of a, the image that sort of comes to me is they would be little points of light, things that were interesting to me. And then I wouldn't yet know like what the constellation of them is going to be. Because of course, when we look up at the sky and we see the hunter or we see Orion's belt, that's because somebody a long time ago like made us connect those things. So in the beginning for me, it's these different like points of light. And the reason that sounds like slightly mystical is that it feels a little that way. I'm often not quite sure why I want to put all these things together. And for that reason, I take a really long time with these very short books because I get stuck a lot. And I also, a lot of things just cease to seem like they have any light to me. I'm just not interested in them after time passes, either because the writing isn't good enough or the idea isn't good enough. So those sort of fall away, but I never write in these I never write like a long draft and then cut it. It's more that I write a series of small pieces and then decide how they go together later.
Well, I heard you relate a very funny story about writing outlines when you were in school, and that you would write the piece first and then go back.
Yeah.
The outline and the index cards.
I'd fake the outline and then I'd fake the index cards with fragmentary notes on them. I guess it's because, I think it's been interesting all these years of knowing other writers and teaching writing students. People are just so different in the way they write. And for many, many fiction writers in particular, that sense of needing to write a draft and then go back with another draft is really, it's just how they write. And they would never, cheat basically and have it all go through and then go back. But for me, I think maybe because I started at the very beginning writing poetry, it's never felt, it's not good poetry. It's not, I just mean that it was an entry point to me for writing. I just always have still just kind of kept it that like smaller unit, and feeling like if I don't get that right, then I can't get the larger story right.
Well, they certainly pack a punch. And I've also heard you speak to the importance of the white space that's around. Can you talk a little bit about, I think you referred to it as your opportunity to collaborate with the reader?
Yeah, I always really like it in a novel when I feel like I'm very much in the hands of an authoritative writer. I know that they are carefully composing this world for me, but there also feels like there's a little bit of openness, a little bit of a moment where I might imagine something too. If you have the kind of writing where everything is compared to something else, there's a way in which I feel like I feel very suffocated by that. If every time something is described, it's compared to something else, I feel like it doesn't, at least for me, make my mind can't quite form its own pictures. It's one of the reasons I'm quite against ever having a face on my book covers, and I'm always fighting. I didn't completely succeed with this one. I got like a little strip, but I did with the paperback, no faces, because I like to be able to imagine the character as however I want the character to look as a reader. Okay. And for me, the white space, it does two things. One, it kind of suggests that these experiences, one of which might seem very obviously important and one of might be seemingly trivial, that they could be on the same plane. And secondly, it provides kind of like a stopping point for this galloping kind of narrative. I mean it to be restful and a time where the reader's own associations can kind of flow in.
It's interesting. I read your book when it first came out, so that was a year ago. And then preparing for this conversation with you, I listened to an audio version.
Oh, I haven't heard it.
Well, I really liked it, but hearing what you say now about faces and encouraging the reader to imagine for themselves what the person looks like, I'm wondering if the woman who read Lizzie would come close. I mean, I'm kind of curious. I have had the experience, I listen to a fair amount of audiobooks. I have had experiences where I didn't like the book because of the reader's voice.
Sure.
And then I've been listening to a lot of Toni Morrison lately, and just hearing her voice brings so much more. I almost don't want to look at her books unless I can have her read to me. So
Right.
it's a very personal thing. The getting back to the fragments, it almost strikes me like it's almost found poetry. And I'm curious about you. Were very drawn to poetry, younger self. And I was wondering if there were particular poets who stuck out to you as, oh, I want to write like that, or, you know, I can really relate to this person.
I mean, I think one of the reasons I didn't become a poet instead of a fiction writer is that my taste, which was formed, you know, when I was in college, was it was really great poets like the Romantics. And if you're reading Coleridge or Wordsworth or something like that, I both felt that it was great and also felt like I could never write that way. And then there were a little bit later on, there were other poets that felt a little more like an entry point, whether that was like John Berryman and later kind of the New York school of poets like Frank O'Hara and Ted Berrigan. Frank O'Hara has this thing where he talks about how his poems are I did this, I did that poems. And if you're really reading them, there's so much more than that. But I love the kind of understated, like offhand brilliance of how he will describe someone just walking around and then build to kind of an emotional, just a feeling that there's some emotional charge to it, to this litany of things. It's funny that you're talking about audiobooks because I managed to get to read my first audiobook myself. I had to audition, but I got to do it. And it was I wanted to do that mostly because I felt like, you know, you're trying for a certain effect when you're writing. And if it's a deadpan effect, or if it's a effect where emotion is kind of coming through, you want to make sure that comes through in the book. And I love audiobooks, but I hate how at the end they have that rising music, because you know, if you're a good writer, you're supposed to have created that equivalent feeling. Right. So I'm always like, well, why did I spend 2 years writing that last page if I could have just had the music do it for me?
Yes. So the book, the writing of the book, you were at it for a number of years, and I guess I read in an interview that a lot of your friends referred to you as a doomer because of your fervency, I guess, about the topic. Did you feel, though, at the end of the book that you still had more to say about weather and climate change, and then did you look for other outlets to express your interest in that or to explore that?
I did. I mean, I felt like, the doomer thing was sort of, I guess it was a little bit of a joke with my friends, because I'd been so not interested in these things before that it was a little bit strange that I was now the person, you know, telling you about how much of the New York subways were under sea level, and that I knew all these facts that I was learning in my writing. But I did feel when I was writing it that it sounds sort of strange, but I was wondering, is there any way to write a novel that is serious about the fear and grief and dread of these questions, but that also is funny and is not self-righteous about what you need to do? Because I do think that everyone has to come to action on their own terms, or they don't stay with it. And for me, you know, I used to joke when I'd come out after writing and say to my husband, oh, I'm so glad I fixed climate change today by writing my weird experimental novel, because it felt like a silly act. But as I reached the end of the novel, I felt like I was much less doomy, because I'd been able to encounter a lot of anecdotes and stories about people working at a local level who were building these, resilient communities, resilient ideas. And so it occurred to me that I not only needed to get involved in activism myself, but that I wanted to highlight some of the ways people have been resilient through terrible times in the past.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're also part of a Writers Rebel group in New York City. Is that also related to contemporary topics like climate change?
Yes. And when I finished my novel, there's sort of that year period while you're before it comes out. And I thought to myself, okay, now's the time to, I'm not much of a joiner, I think, as many bookish people are not joiners, but I felt like I really could see the necessity of collective action. And so I joined with helped start this group that is a subset of the Extinction Rebellion. There wasn't one of the things Extinction Rebellion does, it's a nonviolent direct action group, is they do all these subcategories like doctors for Extinction Rebellion, and it might be like service workers for Extinction Rebellion. And each group tries to figure out what are some ways to get out the word about the climate emergency and help prepare for it within their profession. So as writers, we're doing things like we've partnered with the Brooklyn Public Library, and we're doing a climate read series that's open to everyone in the community. And we're reading a lot of different books. We're trying to provide materials for people that want to teach about like subsets of climate ideas, like environmental racism as that's practiced in America. So it was just getting off the ground, and then the pandemic hit.
Sure.
And so we're sort of getting back on our feet. But what is happening right now is the program through the libraries, which is great, because I feel like libraries are obvious places for kind of climate education.
Right. We have a maker lab, and we were very active in doing, conservation and related kinds of projects until, of course, the pandemic. But I think that's a great way to teach the community how small steps can lead to really powerful collective action. Leaving weather aside for a second, there was another theme in the book about an upcoming election of 2016. And what was it like? So you were writing about it, I guess.
I'd already been writing the book for many years. And I of course didn't know that Trump would win. I hoped he would not. But when he did, I felt very torn, because I was already writing a book that dealt with, some of these very dark themes. And I thought from the very beginning, I was an early encroaching fascism doomer too. So I thought, I felt very early on that our country was just going to be a wrecking ball, had been taken to it. And so I ended up deciding, after some hair pulling about it, that if I didn't include the election, that I would be just kind of freezing the book in amber, because it would be in this space that was not changing, even though our public life was changing quite drastically, almost immediately. It's hard to remember, but like those Muslim bans were like right away, like the part where people were rushing to the airports and trying to stop it. It started right away. And in terms of the climate, thousands of environmental things were rolled back almost immediately. People saw like their whole life's work kind of disappear. And so I decided to make that part of the book as well. And then it's interesting, because when I was finishing the book, I've never done this before. I've never tried to leap forward in time in a book, but I finished it about a year and a half before this fall. And I knew it was going to end with another election. And of course, I didn't know which way it was going to go.
Mhm.
So that was part of the interesting kind of question about how to make the end of the book be something that could work with either outcome.
Mhm. Are you feeling more hopeful about the state of our country or climate change and the attention that will, in theory, be given to it with this new administration? I mean, is this?
Oh yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, certainly I wouldn't have. Biden was not my choice, particularly for the person who was going to be the nominee, but I've been pleasantly surprised, as are the real climate activists I know. I've been pleasantly surprised that he is taking a lot of guidance from groups that are on the ground, like the youth-led Sunrise Movement. And I am seeing, I mean, I feel much more hopeful. I feel like he couldn't have inherited more of a mess.
Mhm.
And that is something we see right now with, getting control of the pandemic. But it is a feeling like things can begin to be built again, and that there's a chance to wish for more progressive policies. Whereas before, I think it was just trying to hold the line and keep less things from being dismantled.
Sure. And as you referred to yourself a second ago as a fascism doom and gloomer, this is the first
Well,
day.
I mean, I'm also a get out the voter. And I think this was a really powerful example of what happens when, I mean, if you think of the grassroots organizations like Stacey Abrams and what she did in Georgia, we wouldn't, I don't think we would have, certainly wouldn't have the Senate if she hadn't done that. And it was also just, it was such hard circumstances because people, there were all these things that were actively suppressing, especially low income voters. And then there was also, it was frightening to vote in person. It was frightening. And just to see all of these people just decide, it made me kind of feel much more like heartfelt about democracy than I felt for a while. It felt like we were snatching it from the jaws of defeat. So yes, I feel much more hopeful. I also think I myself have to be careful not to get complacent again, and to sort of take what I've learned in these more active political years that I've had.
Well, I think that's the key. We can't let our guard down. I mean, January 6th certainly demonstrated how fragile and how in a matter of hours we can be facing a near miss in terms of a catastrophe. So, but I do agree that raising people's awareness that you have to do something. Mm-hmm. Democracy takes constant vigilance, mm-hmm. and it's on the part of everyone. We're all connected. We're all in this together. And I think there were important lessons. I'm not sure that I'm ready to say civics must be taught in the schools again, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I
kind of think maybe, yeah.
I mean, at this point, I remember taking government in high school, and it's fundamental stuff that people need to know about. I also want to talk to you a little bit about this is Black History Month, and Black authors you have read that you would still read today and commend to others.
Sure. Well, I was just talking about how I was teaching Octavia Butler, who I really admire. I always read the work of Claudia Rankine. I think she's just such an amazing, I've been lucky enough to have her as a colleague a few years ago, but she's just always written such beautiful and incisive things. I'm reading a poet, Renee Gladman, who Calamities, that I'm really loving. And I'm teaching a much older book in a class right now, which is My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by Amos Tutola. It's, I feel like, one of the earlier works of African literature that was translated and made it over here. And it's a really interesting book because it's very much playing with and interrogating the oral tradition and how important that has been as a way to shape storytelling. So it's an it is indeed a character like wandering around in a forest of ghosts and ancestors and demons, and it's a really cool book.
Oh, it sounds a lot like there was a Jesmyn Ward book of a couple of years ago about ghosts buried.
Yeah, Sing the Unburied or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you, when you were on with the Loyalty book folks, I guess about a week ago, you mentioned a short story by James Baldwin that I had not read, Sonny's Blue.
Oh, yeah. That's one of my all-time favorite short stories.
I sat right down and found an online PDF of it, and terrific.
Yeah.
Trying to, fill in the gaps in my own reading history. So one of the great things about literature is reading and rereading books and experiencing them over again. And the older we get, seeing something new that we missed previously. So what are you hoping that 100 years from now, people are going to think about when they read Weather or Department of Speculation or your first book? I mean, what are you hoping that a reader will take away from that experience, other than there was a pandemic or there was climate?
Well, of course, it feels quite bold to imagine that people will be reading it 100 years from now. But yes, okay, I'm excited by the thought.
That's how I said
it. One of the reasons I don't name Trump in the book is, and I just try to give a feel for the character, is that I wanted the book to be something where you didn't need to know the particulars of this political moment, but you needed to understand, as has happened many times in history, that some people were looking for a strongman leader, and what that put them in danger of by wanting that. So I hope that, like, always what I'm trying when I write is just to sort of get down on the page as well as I can what it feels like to be alive in a particular moment. And so I think when I read older books, what I always find is that really interesting tension between what I recognize and what I don't. But this is a book that is about dread, and about dread shading into a tentative kind of hope. And that feels to me like a very universal, it's humans are wired to kind of have fear and dread before hope, because that's how we survived. So hopefully that will carry over, the different ways that people have tried to, just find their way, whether it's through books or banding together with other people or all these different things. I feel like those aren't going to go away no matter where we end up in 100 years, which I hope is a better place than here.
Well, I think it was also too about coping and managing and doing the best you can, and doing so with grace and dignity and goodwill. I think a lot of times we forget that we just need to cut each other some slack and assume good intentions, as opposed to everybody's, they're out to get us. And I wish our politics were less emphasizing the divisions between us and more about things that are more unifying, but that's a conversation for another time. So Weather is in the books, so to speak. What are you working on now?
Well, I haven't, I've just begun a new novel. I'm pretty superstitious. I can't really talk about that yet, but I've been writing some interesting smaller things. I had a lot of fun writing a new forward to Mrs. Dalloway, which just came into the public domain, where I did exactly what you're talking about. I kind of looked at a book that I'd read at different points in my life, and how at each of those times that I read it, what I was looking for, what I was finding. And I also think that books kind of, they are these memory vessels, and these ways where we see, like you said, ways that people have been resilient, ways that people have coped. I mean, it's very strange to read Mrs. Dalloway and realize, she was sick in the 1918 pandemic.
Right.
And she recovered from it, because we often, especially pandemics are known for this, once it's over, I mean, that's why we don't have beautiful memorials to the 1918 influenza epidemic, even though many, many people die, because the feeling after we come out of something dark is often that we don't want to look at it again. Mm-hmm. But I think that books and other art forms can kind of allow us a space to re-enter something that was difficult, knowing also that we can come back out of it. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm always, hoping for when I come to a work of fiction or a film or a piece of music.
Well, it's that resilience and that ability to pick yourself back up and, again, keep on keeping on. Well, Jenny Offill, this has been a delightful conversation, and I am looking forward to reading your next book, and I would love to read the Intro to Mrs. Dalloway. That's one of my absolute favorite books. And thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. And we look forward to many new days ahead and more.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.